Hello, I'm David Beeston. I recently completed the podcast series A History of England, which is still available on Spotify and other platforms, and it now feels like a good idea to turn my attention to the country where I actually live, which is Spain. So today we're starting A History of Spain, presented by Nacho Garcia in Spanish and by me in English, and I'd like to welcome you to its first episode, Voices from the Distant Past. Just as in A History of England, this is a history and not the history. It's our take on Spanish history, and while we've done all we can to get things about right, we make no claim to absolute scholarly rigour. Nor do we plan necessarily to comply with the highest standards of impartiality, or at least not all the time. But we hope you'll enjoy it all the same. So where should we start? Maybe the right place is way back before history itself. In other words, in prehistory. It's strange to stand in front of a painting and realise that it's 7,000 years old. The paint's a tad faded these days. 7,000 years will do that even to the best Neolithic pigments. The paintings are a whisper from our ancestors, not a shout, but they talk to us all the same. They're on the walls of what are called rock shelters. Instead of being deep caves, they're relatively shallow indentations in a hillside, maybe as deep as a modern bus shelter. The guys who made them lived in what we now call Baitorta, a valley in the hills of the province of Castellón in the eastern Spanish community of Valencia. There's a museum there now, and as well as working to preserve the originals, the experts there have produced new copies with enhanced colours to help us appreciate them more easily. Those ancestors liked to present themselves as great hunters of large game, deer mostly, or as warriors who engaged in glorious battles against each other with spear in hand and a feathered headdress to mark their heroic status. Seeing those pictures is actually quite heartwarming because, again thanks to the Baitorta archaeologists, we know that their painters were almost certainly hunter-gatherers. Such communities, and there are still a few in the world today, tend to eat lots of nuts and berries from the area around their homes, gathered, in all likelihood, mostly by women. The Baitorta people almost certainly did more gathering than hunting, and even when they did go after animals, it was probably small ones, rabbits or birds, maybe even trapped rather than hunted. That's all much more humdrum than the noble chase of big game like stags. It's nice to know that even 7,000 years ago we had spin doctors at work enhancing our story and giving it the slant we want. What were those characters like? Archaeologists in England have tried to reconstruct the face of a man of that time, now called Cheddar Man, from a skull they found in the Cheddar Gorge in the western county of Somerset. The common view is that the people we're talking about were almost certainly dark-skinned, quite dark enough for us to think of them as black if they reappeared among us. It's likely they had blue eyes. Striking looks, in fact. It's funny to think that Spain and England were inhabited by black settlers all that time ago. Over the next 2,000 or 3,000 years, successive waves of immigration began to dilute that stock. Archaeologists working with DNA have identified a particularly important wave of migrants in the form of a population that may have come from present-day Poland, or, as more generally believed, from Anatolia in modern Turkey. The big change they brought with them was farming. Agriculture got going in the Middle East about 12,000 years ago, in around 10,000 before the Common Era, BCE. The first farmers started arriving in what was going to become Iberia between 5600 and 5500 BCE, some 7,500 years ago. They settled on the coasts and moved up the river valleys. This wasn't an invasion. Certainly there's no evidence of any kind of military conflict. The farmers lived in small communities, and in sparsely populated land there was plenty to go around for new farms. Expansion probably also happened in small groups. You can imagine the adult children of a large settled farming family deciding that it made sense to move out of the family farm and, with plenty of land to go around, set up their own homestead, perhaps further up the river. By the time the rock paintings were going up, the hunter-gatherers were living within a few tens of kilometres of the farming communities of this new population. Genetic evidence from remains from the period show that there were indeed two distinct populations for a time. However, they mixed, no doubt trading with each other and interbreeding, and there comes a time when most people were carrying mixed DNA from both strains. Gradually, the hunter-gatherers probably also adopted the agricultural lifestyle of the later arrivals. So we're now looking at a mixed population. It's probable that hunting and gathering continued for a while at least, if only to supplement the diet produced from farms. But it seems likely that the Baitorta people moved increasingly towards agriculture themselves. If you've read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, you'll know that he classified this as a regrettable step, since agriculture involved a hell of a sight more work than the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And it probably provided a far less well-balanced diet. Farmers, after all, tend to focus on only a small number of crops. That's a sad contrast to the huge variety of nuts and berries, supplemented by occasional meat or fish, that was out there. Of course, at certain times of year, the nut and berry supplies fall drastically, and that could create bleak conditions for the people. It's also likely that population growth may have pushed the move towards agriculture. Today, we like to think of nuts and berries and free-growing plants as wild food, and it's reasonably trendy to eat it. But in pre-agricultural communities, that's all there was on the gathering side, and there's only so much population it will support. With a bigger population, you need a more intensive way of growing food. That generated the pressure to move towards farming, however painful its effect on quality of life. Certainly had a massive impact on a lot more than just diet. Take the landscape for one thing. You'll see this in many parts of Spain, but I'm thinking specifically of Extremadura in the far west, on the border with Portugal. The landscape is glorious, almost parkland, with grassland dotted with trees over huge areas. It's the kind of landscape the Spanish call dehesa, which roughly translates as pasture land. The trees can be of various kinds, but the most common is the home oak, known as the encina in Spanish. This produces the acorns that feed the pigs that give the most highly reputed and therefore most expensive Spanish ham. That mention of pigs and ham is a clue to what I'm going to say next, because that beautiful, park-like countryside is anything but natural. In its natural state, all that country would be covered by unbroken forest, so extensive that it would be easy to get lost in if you wandered too far. It's clearance by human effort that has reduced it to this striking but artificial pasture land. The dehesa environment was formed by man. It is, however, reasonably stable and supports a balance of animals, plants and humans living alongside each other. I wish I could say the same for the environment that our own age is now moulding. We're causing far more damage, and it may well prove irreversible. The other huge effect of agriculture was a consequence of its very efficiency in producing food. Not only could it feed a growing population, at least in good years, it could also go so far as to create a surplus. Now that had a massive impact. Because with that surplus, human societies moved beyond subsistence living and could begin to support a caste of people who would do something other than merely contribute to feeding everyone. And who would make up that caste? Why, the warriors, the priests, and above all, the rulers. From the glass half full point of view, of course, those people provided security against foreign raiders, they provided intellectuals who helped society progress, and they provided administrators who maintained the order that made the other things possible. Taking the glass half empty position, those people formed an elite that didn't just gratefully live off the surplus the producers generated, but made sure that it all came to them. They used the very order they were preserving to ensure they kept getting the lion's share of whatever they wanted. The warriors provided the means to maintain that order. The priests explained that this was the way the gods wanted things. The forms that kind of thing takes these days are a bit different from back then, but the way it makes sure it persists really hasn't changed much, has it? An elite in charge that controls most of the wealth. Forces of order paid for out of what society produces to ensure that things stay that way. In the meantime, what we had back then in Spain was an agricultural society that was developing its own rights and customs and living reasonably well in a self-sustaining environment. If you're ever in Extremadura yourself and travel between that jewel of a city, its capital Mérida, to the nearly equally outstanding city of Badajoz, right out on the Portuguese border, you might make a brief stop to visit the Neolithic monument known as the Dolmen de Lácara. Set in just the kind of dehesa landscape we've been talking about, it's a late Stone Age tomb, partly damaged but still with enough standing to be highly impressive. It's a testimony to a society that had decided that something special needed to be done for its dead, or at least some of its dead, if only the wealthiest and most powerful, and had the spare manpower to haul huge stones over great distances to construct a suitable tomb to bury them in. So we're looking at a self-sustaining, relatively wealthy society with a sophisticated set of structures in place. Unfortunately for that society, a new threat to its well-being was already beginning to build in a region far beyond its knowledge, a long way away in the east. That's out in the steppes of Russia and Ukraine, a distinction between two nations that I insist on making still, despite Mr. Putin's efforts to sponge it out. That was the homeland of a people we call the Yamnaya, from the Russian term for pit grave culture, based on the kinds of tombs they built for their prominent figures. One of the most enduring legacies of the Yamnaya is their language, the ancestor of nearly all of the group we now call Indo-European. You probably speak one of its descendants yourself. You're listening to one now. In the 4th millennium BCE, the Yamnaya were making, or possibly copying, some extraordinary discoveries. Out on the endless plains of the steppes with their bitter winter weather, those discoveries were helping them to develop with frightening speed. That's literally frightening, in the sense that people who weren't frightened ought to have been, and many soon would be. The Yamnaya people had learnt to breed horses, for instance, and not stuck with cattle alone as many others had. Horses are a lot cleverer than cattle. When the weather turns dismal, horses know how to scrape their way through snow and even ice to get to the water or scrub grass underneath. The grass is nothing like as lush as in summer, but it's a lot better than starvation. In 1886, a particularly harsh winter struck the northern plains of the United States, and huge numbers of free-ranging cattle died. Cattle survived best when they followed the mustangs, wild horses, and fed on the grass they'd uncovered. At first, the Yamnaya people kept the horses like their cattle for meat and milk. In time, however, they found a new use for them. Once they'd bred them big enough, they started riding. And that was when another useful invention entered the scene: the wheel. It's possible that they invented it simultaneously with, but independently of, the Sumerians, who also started using it at about the same time, some 5,500 years ago, in Mesopotamia, now in southern Iraq. With both the horse and wheels, the Yamnaya could build carts to carry things and people. That supported their nomadic lifestyle, enabling them to travel around with their herds to wherever there was good forage and water at different times. But mankind seldom makes technological advances only for peaceful purposes. Horses, wheels, how about cavalry and war chariots? Next thing, they were terrifying their neighbours and stealing their ideas, like smelting metal and other wonderful skills. And after that, they started moving around and even conquering their neighbours to occupy their territory. That's something else that hasn't changed down the ages. Do you have a military advantage over some other people? Use it to take over their land. Yep, those were humans all right, and no more humane than the modern ones. They spread across what is now Iran and into northern India, and they spread westward too into Greece, into what are now the Slavic countries, into Germany and Scandinavia, into Britain, into France and into Italy. Eventually, many generations, perhaps even a full millennium after the first migrations of the Yamnaya people, their descendants showed up in Spain. But that's a big subject, one we'll talk about next time. In the meantime, many thanks for listening.